I used to believe there was something broken inside me, that maybe if I spoke softer, smiled wider, or tried harder, he'd finally see me. Maybe then, my father would look at me the way he looked at my brothers, with pride instead of polite disinterest. But no matter what I did, that look never came. My name is Alina, and for as long as I can remember, I've been invisible in my own family. My father, Richard, didn't need to yell to make a point. His silence did all the talking. It filled the space between us, thick and cold, leaving no room for warmth. When I brought home straight A's in middle school, he barely nodded, as if good grades were just something that happened around him, not something worth noticing. But when my brother Jake Cao passed a single class after failing 3, Dad clapped him on the back, grinning from ear to ear. "That's my boy," he said proudly. I was 12 when I realized what I was to him, and what I wasn't. It was Father's Day. I had spent hours that afternoon hunched over a homemade card. Glitter, stickers, a handwritten poem, my masterpiece. I handed it to him after dinner, heart fluttering with excitement. He took it, mumbled a flat, "Thanks," and turned back to his TV game without even opening it. 5 minutes later, Ryan, my youngest brother, strolled in, tossed him a store-bought mug that said 1-1 Dad, and suddenly, the whole room was glowing. Dad laughed, held up the mug like it was a trophy, and said, "Now, this is something." I stood there, my card still in my hands, the edges starting to curl beneath my fingers. That's when it sank in. No matter what I did, it would never be enough. Ryan and Jake were the golden boys. Ryan, the athlete. Jake, the charmer. They filled every space in the house with their light. And me? I was the quiet one. The shadow. The girl who spent too much time in her room writing stories and sketching imaginary worlds. Worlds where someone actually noticed her. Mom tried to fill the gaps sometimes. She'd hug me and whisper, "You're special too, sweetheart." But even she couldn't change the unspoken rules that governed our house. If Ryan wanted the last slice of pizza, he got it. If Jake needed money, Dad handed it over without a question. But when I once asked for a new sketchbook, Dad didn't even look up from his newspaper. "What's the point?" he said flatly. "You'll give up halfway like everything else." Those words stayed with me longer than I care to admit. Dinner conversations followed the same pattern. Dad asking my brothers about their goals, their dreams, their next big thing. Me? I was the audience. If I dared to speak, I was met with a nod that said, "Be quiet now," or a tight-lipped smile that never reached his eyes. So, I learned silence. I learned to shrink my voice, to make room for theirs. But beneath the quiet, something else was growing. Something fierce. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was fire, anger, a determination I couldn't name yet, but one that would soon define me. I stopped trying to earn his love. I stopped waiting for his praise. Instead, I built something else. A life that would one day make him regret never seeing me. If you walked into our house during the holidays, you'd think we were the perfect family. Laughter spilling from the kitchen, Dad grilling in the backyard, my brothers tossing a football in the snow while Mom set the table. From the outside, it looked like a commercial for happiness. But I knew better. I knew what it felt like to be the extra in someone else's perfect picture. Jake, the eldest, was born to charm. He could sell sunshine to the sky and make it believe it was the moon. He never studied but somehow always passed, and Dad adored him for it. They shared inside jokes, matching fishing hats, even a secret handshake they made up when Jake was 10. I remember watching them once, hidden behind the doorway, as Jake showed Dad a crumpled napkin with some business idea scribbled across it. Dad's eyes lit up like he was staring at genius itself. "You've got the brain of a leader, son," he said proudly. "Add a little polish, and that could be something big." Ryan, the youngest, was the star athlete, Dad's golden boy. Soccer trophies lined his shelves, medals glinting under the warm bedroom light. Rain or shine, Dad never missed a game. He was that parent, yelling encouragement from the sidelines, pumping his fist when Ryan scored. When Ryan led his team to a championship, Dad threw a full-blown backyard party. Barbecue, neighbors, music, all for Ryan's goal. I was there too, setting out plates, cleaning up after the laughter. I remember thinking how invisible I must have looked, moving between their moments like a shadow cleaning up the glitter. When I got accepted into the honors program, I thought, finally. Maybe this time it would be different. It wasn't. At breakfast the next morning, Dad just said, "Honors? That's nice," between bites of toast. No hug, no smile, just indifference. Still, I kept going. I pushed myself harder, working 2 part-time jobs to pay for extra classes. I won quiet awards that no one in my family noticed. I earned a scholarship that no one mentioned. My success never made it past the breakfast table. At dinners, Dad would beam as he talked about Jake's new startup or Ryan's latest win. "Jake, tell them about that investor meeting," he'd say, leaning forward, pride radiating from him. When I mentioned my internship at a top firm, he'd just nod, half listening, already turning back to my brothers. That's when I realized it wasn't about what I achieved. It was about who was achieving it. They were the main event. I was the filler between acts, but I didn't hate my brothers. Not once. They weren't cruel. They loved the attention, sure, but they didn't fight me for it. My father simply never gave me a chance, so I stopped asking for it. Yet deep down, some part of me still hoped. Still wished for one moment, one honest, unprompted, "I'm proud of you, Alina." It never came, but something else did. Something that would change everything. Not just for me, but for all of us. It happened the year I decided to stop waiting for permission to shine. After years of silent ambition, I launched my own startup, a digital platform designed to bridge small businesses with local clients. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. Every late night, every tear, every bit of me was poured into it. The launch event took place downtown, in a sleek, glass-walled conference room filled with journalists, investors, and a hum of curiosity. My hands trembled as I stepped up to the podium. For once, I didn't need anyone's approval. The room's attention was mine. I spoke about my vision, the years of work behind it, the sleepless nights, and when I finished, the applause that followed felt like oxygen. People came up to me afterward, investors, reporters, mentors, shaking my hand, praising my concept. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible, but that feeling didn't last long. A week later, we had a family dinner, a celebration, though not for me. Our family gatherings were less about love and more about competition disguised as conversation. My brothers arrived like they always did, loud, confident, glowing in Dad's reflected pride. Dad sat at the head of the table, carving meat with practiced ease, smiling between stories. "Ryan hit his 3rd home run this season," he announced proudly, and the table erupted in applause. "And Jake, I hear you closed another big deal this week, son. Fantastic work." His voice carried that easy, rolling warmth he reserved only for them. I waited. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd mention me, my company, the event that had drawn local headlines. So I spoke up. "Actually, Dad," I said, my voice steady but hopeful. "I just launched my own venture last week. It's been doing really—" He waved his hand, cutting me off mid-sentence. Yes, we know you're busy, sweetheart." His tone was light, dismissive, like I was talking about a new hobby instead of the work that had defined my entire life. The room went quiet for half a second before someone changed the subject. That silence was louder than any insult. Sitting there, surrounded by laughter that wasn't for me, I felt something shift, something final. Every ignored accomplishment, every unspoken word of pride, every quiet dismissal, they all hit at once. And in that quiet wreckage, a strange clarity bloomed. It didn't matter how many trophies I earned or companies I built. He'd never see me. He'd never be proud. Not because I wasn't enough, but because I was never the version of enough he wanted. But one day, I promised myself he would remember me, not as the quiet daughter who sat in the shadows, but as the woman who stepped out of them and never looked back. It was in that heart-shattering instant that I understood I could no longer play the quiet part in this tragic family drama. I would build a life so brilliant, so undeniable, that he could no longer dismiss me. And if he continued to steal me moments, then perhaps he'd finally face the consequences of his endless favoritism. After that dinner, something inside me shut down. Not out of anger, but clarity. I stopped trying, not in the sense of giving up, but in the sense of no longer seeking approval that would never come. I didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't ask to be heard anymore. I simply went quiet. I started spending less time at family gatherings and more time in silence. Just me and my goals. I moved out of the city, rented a modest but quiet apartment on the edge of town, and dug into my work like it was oxygen. The startup that I had launched, barely noticed by my own family, was now my world. It didn't pay much at first. I had weeks where dinner was just toast and instant coffee. I had to take freelance projects on the side to stay afloat. There were nights I cried quietly under my desk, questioning if I was even built for this. But for every doubt, there was a flicker of determination. I had no one clapping for me, no one cheering me on, but I was finally building for myself. I learned to fix bugs, write pitches, handle rejections, and chase clients with a kind of hunger only someone used to being overlooked could ever understand. Some nights, I would scroll through social media and see photos of Jake at business conferences with Dad by his side, or Ryan holding yet another trophy with a caption about making the family proud. I'd feel that familiar sting like a wound reopening. But I didn't let it stop me. Instead, I'd take a deep breath, close the app, and get back to work. My success wouldn't come from applause. It would come from perseverance. I grew in silence. No fancy updates, no family newsletters, just long nights, stubborn effort, and the occasional client saying, "You're the only one who actually listened to what we needed." Those words felt better than anything my father could have said because they were real. After a year, the company started gaining traction. Our user base grew. A niche investor found potential in what we were doing and poured in seed money. I finally hired a small team. People who, like me, knew what it felt like to be underestimated. Together we built something incredible. Still, I stayed quiet. I didn't send out the usual holiday emails. I didn't show up at family events with success stories to toss around like confetti. I let them assume I was the same girl in the background living small. That's how I wanted it. But within me, everything was changing. My posture shifted. My voice got firmer. I wasn't afraid to take up space anymore. I didn't need their validation. I had found something better. I had found me. For the first time in my life, I made decisions without second-guessing. I bought my first car on my own. I signed the lease to a sleek office space with floor-to-ceiling windows. And I did it without needing someone to tell me, "Good job." I became the woman I had once only dreamed of becoming. The one my younger self thought she had to become for them. But now I was doing it for me. And in all that silence, I was building something far more powerful than a career. I was building freedom. I still remember the first time I walked past a mirror and didn't flinch. My reflection didn't look like the forgotten daughter anymore. She looked like someone who had clawed her way out of invisibility and created a life of her own design. And it wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet strength, the kind that doesn't beg to be seen but can't be ignored. And soon they wouldn't be able to ignore me either. Not after what I was about to do. I hadn't been home in almost 2 years. Not for birthdays, not for holidays, not even for the obligatory phone calls. The silence was mutual. Noon reached out to check on me, and I didn't expect them to. That's the thing about being forgotten. You eventually become comfortable with your own absence. But this year I made a decision. I recipe-P'd to the annual Father's Day dinner. No explanation, no follow-up, just a simple "I'll be there" in the family group chat. The reactions were a mix of emojis and passive silence. I could almost feel the awkwardness through the screen. The night before, I stood in front of a sleek black luxury car in a dealership showroom, signing paperwork under a fake last name I had legally changed to after launching my business. They wouldn't even recognize it. None of them had ever asked what I was doing or who I was becoming. Next to me sat a small black envelope. The edges were crisp, the paper heavy and expensive. Inside was a single legal document that would change everything. Father's Day arrived. Addressed carefully, not to impress, but to remind myself who I had become. Confidence in every inch of fabric, power in every step. When I pulled into the driveway, the car's engine purred like a warning. My siblings were already there, clinking glasses and laughing on the patio. Dad was at the head of the table, grinning wide, drinking hand, the favorite role he played so well. His eyes flicked toward me, and for a moment, confusion broke through his usual smugness. Then a smile. "Well, look who finally decided to show up." Everyone turned. I could feel their surprise and judgment settle into the air. I smiled politely. Hi, everyone. Happy Father's Day, Dad. The dinner was the same mix of forced laughs and subtle jabs. Jake talked about his new condo. Ryan bragged about another promotion. Dad nodded and beamed like a king surrounded by princes. And then came the moment. Aya stood up slowly, the quiet drawing everyone's attention. I brought something for you, I said, looking directly at Dad. I walked outside, leaving the door open behind me. Moments later, I drove the luxury car into the driveway. Sleek, black, impossible to ignore. I got out, walked back inside, and laid the small black envelope on the table in front of him. For you, Dad. Happy Father's Day. Gasps rippled through the room. Is that a car? Jake asked, squinting toward the driveway. Ryan leaned forward. Wait, you bought that? Dad looked from the keys tome, completely stunned. He picked up the envelope, his fingers trembling a little. What's this? Just open it, I said quietly, my voice calm and steady. Everyone leaned in as he slipped the paper out. For a second his expression didn't change. Then his eyes started darting over the page, and slowly his face drained of color. His jaw clenched. What is this? He barked, now glaring at me. I gave him a long, unreadable smile. Read it carefully. You'll see. And with that I turned, walked out the door, and got into the car. I drove away as the shouting started behind me. Because that envelope, it wasn't just paper. It was the ownership document of the company that had just acquired the firm he worked for. His job, his pride, his status, all now under my control. Happy Father's Day indeed. The house looked the same, tastefully decorated, spotless cold. My mother moved in and out of the dining room like a silent shadow, refilling glasses and smiling at jokes that weren't funny. My brothers were already a few drinks in, and their felt thick with old habits and unspoken rules. I sat quietly at the end of the table, the black envelope resting in my purse, heavy like heartbeat. The car keys were tucked safely into my coat pocket, parked just outside the window in full view of the driveway. The conversation swirled around me like I wasn't even there. Ryan talked about his latest investment win. Jay cracked jokes about people who still rent. And Dad, of course, nodded in approval, soaking in the pride like sunlight. So how's business, Dad? Jake asked, lifting his glass. Dad chuckled. Busy as always. But you know, not everyone is cut out for this kind of pressure. Takes real backbone. He looked at Ryan. Good thing I've got 2 sons who aren't afraid to lead. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. It wasn't even subtle anymore. Then he glanced down the table toward me. I could feel the moment shift before he even opened his mouth. And then there's the loser sitting at the table, he said, gesturing toward me with a smirk, still pretending to be the black sheep. Huh? The laughter exploded. Jake nearly choked on his drink. Ryan laughed so hard he had to slap the table. My hand stayed folded in my lap. I didn't blink. I didn't smile, I just waited. When the laughter finally died down, I stood up slowly, calmly. The way you move when you already know how the story ends. I actually brought you something, Dad, I said, pulling the envelope from my purse. A little Father's Day gift. The room stilled. Even the air seemed to pause. I walked down the length of the table and placed the envelope directly in front of him. He glanced at it, puzzled. What is this? Just open it, I said, then stepped back and folded my arms. Ripped the flap with dramatic flair, as if expecting a joke or cash. His fingers unfolded the paper, and as his eyes began to scan the words, the color in his face changed. First confusion, then disbelief, then a slow, creeping horror. What? What the hell is this? He asked, looking up at me, eyes narrowing. You remember Anderson Tech? The company you've worked at for the last 10 years? I said softly. It's under new ownership, a beat. I bought it, I continued through a silent acquisition. Effective last week, this silence was immediate, deafening. He leaned in slightly and added, So, no, I'm not the loser at the table. I'm the woman who just became your boss's boss. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Jake looked pale. Ryan dropped his fork. And that car out front, I said, glancing toward the window. That was part of the presentation. But I'll be taking it with me now. I turned without waiting for permission, walked outside and slid into the driver's seat. The sound of Theengene roared to life. And just as it pulled away, I heard it, his scream from the open front door. It wasn't anger. It was fear. The car's engine hummed steadily as I drove away from the house. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, the weight of what I had just done settling into my chest. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about something much deeper. For years I had let myself shrink in the shadows of a family that never truly saw me, and now I was standing tall, casting a shadow they couldn't ignore. But the weight of Themament wasn't the only thing pulling at me. I knew what was happening behind me. I could picture it as clearly as if I were still sitting at that table, hearing the deafening silence that followed my words. I wasn't there anymore, but my actions would speak louder than anything I could have said. Back inside, my father's hands were shaking as he held the paper. He looked from it to his son's, his lips moving as though he were trying to find words that wouldn't come. I could see the panic beginning to bloom, creeping through every muscle in his body, spreading like a virus. "Dad," Jake asked, his voice suddenly small. He stood up, coming around to where Dad sat frozen, the paper still gripped tightly in his hands. "What's going on?" Ryan, the ever-confident one, had already stood up as well, trying to peek over their father's shoulder. "What is that? It looks like wait, is that real?" Dad didn't answer. His eyes were glued to the document, his fingers skimming the words, but failing to make sense of them. The words on the page were simple enough, but for him, they were a death sentence. I could already hear their questions in my mind. The panic, the disbelief, the frantic rush to understand what was happening. They'd always relied on him for answers. Now the answers were slipping away, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Finally, Jake couldn't take the silence anymore. "Dad, what does it say?" "What's going on?" Dad looked up, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't catch his breath. It's a transfer of property," he muttered, his voice weak. "A reversal of assets, all of it. The company, the house, my shares." The panic in his voice was palpable. Hissens froze. Ryan blinked in disbelief. "Wait, you're telling me this? This document means she owns everything." The realization hit them like a slap. Thesilence deepened, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was suffocating. My father had always been the pillar, the one everyone turned to for stability. But now he was the one on his knees, his empire crumbling before his eyes. Hissens had no idea how to process it. Jake staggered back from the table, his face going red. How could she do this?" he hissed, his voice rising in anger. She's nothing. We're the ones who worked for this." "How could she?" Dad held up a shaking hand, his mind still trying to catch up with the magnitude of what had just happened. She's not nothing," he said, his voice cracking. "She's everything." Ryan's eyebrows furrowed, his earlier cockiness replaced with uncertainty. "What do you mean, Dad?" "What's going on? How could she?" "She owns it all," Dad said, his voice barely a whisper. "She owns the company. She owns the house. Everything. Everything I've worked for, it's hers now." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The sons who had once worshipped their father, who had seen him as the king of their world, were now faced with a reality they could hardly comprehend. They hadn't even considered her as a contender. To them, I was the shadow, the forgotten one, the own who wasn't enough. But now I was the one who held the power. "I don't understand," Jake said, his voice shaking now. "How could she? When did this happen? Why didn't we know?" Dad finally looked up, his face etched with defeat. "She didn't want you to know. She didn't need to tell you. She doesn't need us." Ryan took a step back, trying to collect himself. "But how did she get this much? How?" "She didn't ask for anything," Dad said, his voice cold now. "She just took it." The room was frozen in disbelief, the wake of the betrayal of my quiet, calculated rise settling over them all. For the first time in their lives, my brothers were forced to confront their reality. They had been so blind to 4 years. I was not the failure they thought I was. I was the one who had worked silently without the applause, without the validation. And now everything they depended on was mine. My father let out a long, ragged sigh. "She's smarter than I gave her credit for," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "And I'll never be able to take that back." The fear, the panic, it was all there, written on their faces. But for me, it was the start of something new. The start of me taking my place in the world, not as the forgotten daughter, but as the woman who had finally earned her right to be seen. I didn't look back as I walked away from that house. The weight that had been holding me down for so long, the constant need to prove myself, the hunger for approval that would never come, finally lifted. I had made it, not because they'd recognized me, but because I had recognized myself. The phone buzzed with messages. The family was scrambling, trying to figure out what I had done, why I had left so suddenly, and what that paper meant. I knew they would be in shock, especially my father. But I didn't care. I had already taken what I needed from them. The power to stand on my own, to walk away from everything I had once thought I needed. I wasn't the girl they always seigneured. I wasn't the daughter they thought they could control or dismiss. I was my own person now, free from the chains of their expectations. As the evening went on, I knew they were probably still sitting there, staring at that paper, trying to comprehend the magnitude of it. My father, who had always dismissed my efforts, would now understand what I was capable of. But it would be too late. All those years of neglect of treating me as second best had finally caught up with him. The house would never be the same. The balance of power had shifted, and I was no longer the one they could manipulate or overlook. The siblings, who had always competed for his affection, who'd never seen me as a true equal, would finally understand that I wasn't just a side player in their world. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their love or their recognition. I had created a life for myself that didn't depend on them. I was successful, independent, and finally at peace. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw someone who'd fought for her place in the world. Someone who didn't need to look back to know she had won. The door was closed. I had walked out, but I had also walked into my own future, one that was all mine.